He had everything except the one thing he couldn't buy: peace. And she had nothing but her quiet strength. James Whitmore was a billionaire with a perfectly curated life, tailored suits, magazine covers, dinner dates with women the world envied. But when the cameras turned off, he returned to silence, to a home filled with memories of a wife he couldn't save. He wasn't looking for love. He wasn't even looking to feel. Grace Ellison had traded chalkboards for hospital waiting rooms, giving up her teaching dreams to care for a fading parent. Her life was far from glamorous, but in the quiet corners of her world, she left handwritten notes, made too strong coffee, and held space for others to breathe. Then one morning, a tabloid on a billionaire's desk, a red circle, a scribbled note, and a flicker of something neither of them expected. If you had to choose between the safety of solitude and the terrifying risk of being fully known, what would you choose? This is a story about grief, hope, and the kind of love that doesn't arrive loudly, but stays quietly. If it touches something in you, leave a comment, share your story, and don't forget to subscribe to Shining Stories for more moments that heal. Now, let's begin. Everyone thought James Whitmore had it all: power, wealth, women. But no one asked if he ever felt anything to the world. He was a symbol of success, the kind you read about in business magazines or spot briefly on television, with a perfectly tailored suit and an expression carved from marble. He was 44 CEO of one of the largest real estate empires in the South. Whitmore & Co. had developments in 5 states and counting. His image was polished, curated, intentional. Every quarter, a new cover story. Every gala, a new companion. The press never had to dig too deep. James gave them just enough to stay intrigued and never enough to get too close. And that was exactly how he liked it. 7 years ago, the man behind the headlines was a husband, a man in love. Elizabeth was the kind of woman who filled a room without saying a word. She believed in handwritten thank you notes and baking at midnight just because a song reminded her of her grandmother. When she passed quietly, cruelly, without warning, James didn't break down. He built walls. He didn't cry. He closed. He filled the space she left with late meetings, expensive wine, and a dating pattern so predictable that even gossip blogs joked about scheduling his breakups on a calendar. His companions were always flawless: long legs, high cheekbones, mysterious eyes. But no one stayed longer than a quarter, sometimes not even a month. He wasn't heartless. He was simply tired. Tired of pretending he was whole. Tired of carrying grief like a shadow that no one else could see. And so, on that Monday morning, like every other, James stepped into his office at exactly 8:03 a.m. The Charleston skyline stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The golden light of spring filtered in gently, catching on the silver edge of his cufflinks. His assistant, Grace, always set the thermostat to 71 degrees. He liked that. Quiet consistency. He expected the usual. But today, something was off. On his desk, resting atop the day's schedule, was a tabloid magazine. Not the kind he read, he didn't read any. But this one had a glossy, full-page photo of him, arm in arm, with a woman he could barely name. She had been his date to the Savannah Gala 3 nights ago, a swimsuit model, if he remembered correctly. They had shared 1 drink, 2 rehearsed smiles, and 0 real conversation. The headline read, "Southern Tycoon's Latest Flame, a Model Romance." But what caught his attention wasn't the photo. It was the thick red circle drawn around his face, and the sticky note beside it, in familiar, elegant handwriting. It said, "Your taste in headlines is almost as consistent as your taste in women. Welcome back, Boss G.E." James stared at the note, still standing, still holding his leather briefcase in one hand and his silence in the other. Grace Ellison, his assistant of 3 years, 36 years old, intelligent, witty, unfiltered, and the only person in the building who dared poke at the mask he wore. She didn't flirt. She didn't flatter. She just noticed things. like how he took his coffee stronger on rainy days, or how he pressed his fingers to his temple when reading legal contracts. She once brought him a chamomile tea when he had a headache, not because he asked, but because she saw. James lowered himself into his chair and leaned back slowly, the magazine still in hand. For a moment, he said nothing. The room was still. Outside, the muffled rhythm of Charleston life moved on. But inside, something in him shifted just slightly. The article was meaningless. He'd seen hundreds like it. But the note, that was different. It wasn't sarcastic cruelty or envy. It was a quiet nudge, a playful jab, a truth no one else dared speak. That maybe he was becoming a man so predictable. Even his loneliness had a brand. He picked up the note again. Thin, pink, ordinary. But somehow, it felt heavier than the magazine it rested on. He turned it over. Nothing on the back, just her initials. G.E. James looked toward the hallway beyond his office door. He imagined her at her desk, likely sipping her usual peppermint tea, typing away, pretending not to wait for his reaction. She always did that, left her thoughts in ink, then disappeared into silence. He dropped the magazine into the bin under his desk. It fell with a soft rustle, like the closing of a file no longer worth keeping. But the note, he folded it once, precisely, then again, until it fit neatly between his fingers. Without thinking, he slipped it into the inside pocket of his suit, the fabric of the jacket pressed against his chest, right where a heart used to ache, still ached, some days. Less loudly now. He sat there for another minute, staring out at the city below, people rushing to work, horns honking, the hum of ordinary life. And for the first time in a long while, James Whitmore didn't feel like a headline. He felt like a man who'd just been gently called back to earth. He tossed the magazine in the trash, but the note, he folded and slipped into his jacket pocket. She brought him coffee every morning. But today, it tasted different. Because she was different. James noticed it the moment he took his first sip. Still hot, still dark, still 2 sugars, no cream, but there was something else, something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the faint trace of cinnamon, or maybe it was the silence that came with it. Usually, Grace left the cup with a handwritten note, sometimes a quote, sometimes a sarcastic jab, always folded neatly under the cup's sleeve. But not today. Just coffee, just quiet. He stared at the cup for a moment longer than usual, then turned his attention to the inbox glowing on his screen. Still, the taste lingered, and not just on his tongue. Grace Ellison had been working for him for nearly 3 years, 36, quietly sharp, always a step ahead, and rarely one to be impressed. She was punctual to a fault, meticulous with schedules, and never once laughed too loudly in meetings. But she had a way of observing the world and him that made her different. Before working at Whitmore & Co., she had been a high school English teacher, a good one, by the sound of it. Her resume had been filled with volunteer hours, community reading projects, and student testimonials that read more like love letters. But she'd left that world behind when her mother fell ill. Stage 4 lymphoma. The kind that doesn't give you time to plan, only time to react. Grace had packed up her classroom, hugged her students goodbye, and never looked back. She took the assistant job out of necessity, not ambition, but over time, her quiet competence reshaped the office. She organized files James didn't know he needed, caught typos and press releases before the PR team did, and never, not once, asked him about his personal life. That alone made her different. Every morning, like clockwork, she arrived 15 minutes early, set up the day, placed his coffee exactly 2 inches from the right edge of his desk, then disappeared until needed. But on certain mornings, especially when the sky hung low with the weight of rain, she left notes, simple, wry, honest, like the one from last spring. Don't forget your umbrella. CEOs catch colds too. Or the one from last Christmas. Even the Grinch took a day off. Just saying. He never responded, but he never threw them away either. They were tucked into a small drawer beneath his desk. No one knew. That morning, James waited for Grace to appear with her usual soft knock and dry humor. But hours passed. Emails came and went, meetings, rescheduled, a call with investors, wrapped early. Still, she didn't come in. Just as he was about to buzz the front desk, she appeared, hair damp from the mist outside, shoulders hunched slightly, and in her eyes something he couldn't quite place. "Morning," she said, setting a file on his desk. He looked up. "You're late." She glanced at her watch. "By 6 minutes. I'll dock my pay." There it was, the quick wit, the unbothered tone. But something in her voice cracked, ever so slightly, like a surface under pressure. He watched as she turned to leave, but before she reached the door, he said, "You forgot the note." Grace paused, then turned with a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Today's note is invisible ink," she said, and then she was gone. The rest of the morning passed in meetings and phone calls, but James found his attention drifting. He began to notice things. How his water bottle had been refilled without him asking. How the meeting room had fresh markers. How the projector's faulty remote had finally been replaced. Things Grace handled without fanfare. And for the first time, he wondered what did she need, who looked after her later that afternoon, while searching for an archived contract. James stepped into the storage room at the end of the hall. It was a narrow space, dimly lit, lined with file cabinets and unopened boxes. As he reached for the switch, he heard a voice, not loud, not clear, but trembling. He froze. "Yes, I understand, but she's getting worse. She didn't sleep at all last night. Grace." She was tucked into the corner, phone pressed to her ear, shoulders tight, her back to the door, a stack of folders clutched against her chest like armor. "No, I can't leave early again. I already switched my shift twice. I need a minute." "Okay." Her voice cracked on the last word, and then silence. James stepped back, slowly, careful not to make a sound. He let the door click shut behind him and didn't say a word. He didn't know why he didn't interrupt. Maybe because for once, he saw her not as the assistant who always had the answer, but as a daughter, a woman, someone, human. Back in his office, he sat at his desk but didn't reach for the keyboard. He didn't check his phone. He didn't touch the cold coffee beside him. He just sat and listened, in his mind, to the echo of her voice shaking, small, fighting not to fall apart. He walked away quietly, but her trembling voice stayed with him for the rest of the day. She had her own life, her own struggles, and he had never once asked. For 3 years. Grace Ellison had been a quiet constant in James Whitmore's perfectly managed life. She showed up early, stayed late, and moved through the office with the kind of calm that suggested nothing in the world could shake her. But yesterday had changed something. It wasn't just the missed note, or the strange quietness in her usual voice. It was that moment in the storage room, the one James hadn't meant to witness. Her back turned, shoulders drawn in, voice cracking on the word worse. That moment haunted him more than he cared to admit. He wasn't used to wondering about the lives of others. His world was built on numbers, deals, and performance. But now, he couldn't stop thinking about hers. That evening, after most of the office had gone home, James sat alone at his desk and pulled up Grace's employee file, not to invade, but to understand. Her emergency contact was listed as Linda Ellison, her mother, same last name, Charleston address, no spouse, no siblings, just one woman carrying a lot on her own. He picked up his phone and made a quiet call to an old connection at Charleston General Hospital. "What do you know about Rosewood Care Center?" he asked. The pause on the other end was telling. "It's under-resourced," the man replied, not neglectful, just barely hanging on. That was all James needed to hear. By the next morning, he had made arrangements, a private room at St. Francis, a top oncologist, everything done quietly, discreetly, respectfully. All that was left was to offer. When Grace arrived, James didn't wait. He stepped out of his office as she was setting down her bag. Her hair was pulled into a low bun, and she looked tired, more so than the day before. "Grace," he said, "can I speak with you?" She looked up, surprised. Of course. He led her into his office, closed the door gently, and turned to face her. "I hope you'll forgive me," he began, "but I made a few inquiries yesterday." Her posture stiffened, but she said nothing. "I know your mother is at Rosewood," he continued, his voice low, "and I know they're doing the best they can, but it's not enough. She deserves better." He handed her a cream-colored envelope. "This covers a full transfer to St. Francis. Private care, specialist attention, no strings attached." Grace didn't move. Her hands stayed at her sides. Her eyes, clear and direct, met his without flinching. After a long pause, she said, "I'm not accepting this." James blinked. "It's not charity. I know what it is," she said quietly, "and I'm still not accepting it." Her voice wasn't cold. It wasn't angry. It was, "Now steady, I've taken care of my mother alone for 6 years," she continued. "And yes, it's hard, but if I accept this from you, James, then the story becomes something else. It becomes me needing you to fix my life, and I can't let that happen." James looked down at the envelope. It felt heavy now, heavier than it had when he handed it over. "It's not that I don't appreciate it," she added, softer this time. "I do. But I've worked too hard to protect my sense of self. This gift would feel like a trade, even if you didn't mean it that way." Silence settled between them, thick and unmoving. She stepped forward and gently placed the envelope back on his desk. "Thank you," she said. "But no." James watched her for a long moment, uncertain of what to say. He had never met a woman who could disarm him so completely without even raising her voice. Just before she turned to leave, he spoke again. "There's a charity gala this Saturday," he said. Grace turned back slowly. "And I'm expected to go," he replied, "but I'd rather not go alone." Her brow lifted, a trace of humor in her expression. "Don't you usually go with a model on your arm?" He didn't smile. "That's the problem." Grace tilted her head, studying him. "So, you're inviting me? Why? Because I don't want to be a headline this time. I want to bring someone real." Her eyes narrowed slightly, not unkindly. "I'm not some statement piece, James." "I know that," he said. "That's why I asked." A pause. Then another. She let out a slow breath. "I don't have anything to wear to a black tie gala. You can expense it. I won't." He gave the smallest nod. Of course she wouldn't. Grace reached for the door but turned back once more. "This isn't a date," she said firmly. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." But even as the words left his mouth, they didn't sound convincing, not even to him. He sat down at his desk after she left, staring at the envelope she'd returned. In all his years of building towers and closing deals, James had never been told no like that before. Not with grace, not with strength, not with dignity. And strangely, it didn't offend him. It made him feel. It wasn't a date. At least, that's what they both told themselves. She didn't sparkle like the others. But when she walked in, he forgot how to breathe. James Whitmore had attended dozens of galas. They all blurred together now, crystal chandeliers, clinking glasses, laughter that never quite reached anyone's eyes. He showed up in black tuxedos tailored to perfection, shook the right hands, posed for the right cameras. He always brought a date, a safe one, someone beautiful, well-mannered, discreet. They looked good on paper, but tonight he wasn't thinking about paper. He stood outside Grace's apartment building just after 6. It was an older complex nestled among blooming dogwoods, with chipped paint on the stair rails and wind chimes clinking softly in the breeze. She came down slowly, holding the hem of her long dress so it wouldn't brush the ground. The dress wasn't trendy. It wasn't glittering or cut to impress. It was a deep navy, vintage, with lace along the collarbone and short sleeves. The kind of dress you wore because it meant something. And it did. It had belonged to her mother. The shoes, she later confessed, were borrowed from a friend, half a size too small. But when she reached the car, James could hardly speak. He opened the door for her, his voice a little lower than usual. "You look," Grace smiled, "different from your usual plus ones." He let out a soft breath. "You look like someone I might actually remember." That made her pause, just for a second. The gala was held at the Charleston Conservatory, an old estate-turned-event space with ivy-covered columns and fountains that whispered beneath the night air. The parking lot shimmered with expensive cars. Inside, the chandeliers burned like frozen stars. They entered together, drawing attention. James was used to being looked at. Grace was not. Heads turned. Some women whispered behind jeweled clutches. A man from the board raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised. A few guests nodded politely, unsure what to make of her. Grace noticed it all, but she didn't shrink. She walked beside James with quiet strength. She smiled when introduced. She listened carefully. And when someone asked her what she did, she didn't say just an assistant. She said, "I help keep Whitmore & Co. running smoothly, and I edit his typos." The honesty in her tone earned a few polite laughs. James, standing beside her, found himself watching, not just noticing her, but seeing her. The way she rested her hand lightly on the edge of her clutch, like it grounded her, the way her eyes softened when speaking to the staff, the way she didn't try to prove herself, but simply was for someone who didn't sparkle. Grace drew light toward her. Halfway through the evening, James barely heard the speeches, the donors, the toasts, the carefully orchestrated applause. They faded into background noise. He looked for Grace across the ballroom. She was standing near the window, watching the lights reflect in the garden pond below. Something pulled him toward her. "Want to get some air?" he asked softly when he reached her side. She nodded. They stepped out onto the wide stone balcony. The night was cool, gentle. Below them, the garden buzzed with quiet conversation. But up here, it was peaceful. Grace leaned against the balustrade, looking out. "I know I don't belong here," she said after a moment. James turned to her. "Why would you think that?" She shrugged, not bitterly. "Just honestly, I'm not polished. I don't have designer shoes or know the names of foundation chairs. But I'm here, and I'm okay." He watched her profile, the soft curve of her cheek lit by moonlight. He realized, in that moment, that she didn't just show up. She belonged because she carried herself with truth. "No one here feels like they belong," he said quietly. "They just get better at pretending." Grace looked at him then, her eyes meeting his. Something passed between them. Not flirtation, not expectation. Something older. Something real. He stepped closer, barely a breath between them. His hand brushed hers. Her lips parted, just slightly. The world slowed, then James. The voice was light, sultry, practiced. He turned, and there she was. Tara Monroe, runway model, magazine favorite, his date from last year's gala. She wore red stunning, sharp, impossible to ignore. And she was smiling like she already owned the conversation. "I didn't know you were bringing company," she said smoothly. James felt Grace take a small step back, not out of fear, just awareness. "I was just leaving," Grace said, her voice calm. "You don't have to," he began, but she was already turning. She smiled at Tara politely, then walked past them with her head high. James stood frozen. He didn't follow, didn't explain, just watched her walk away. And in that still moment, surrounded by wealth and wonder, James Whitmore felt the first real regret he'd felt in years. The house stood silent, just like the years he had buried inside it. It was a white brick colonial on a quiet street lined with sycamore trees. The lawn was overgrown now, the shutters faded to a dusty gray. But once, this place had been full of music, cinnamon, and warmth. It had been home. James parked the car by the curb and sat for a moment, hands resting on the wheel, eyes fixed on the front steps. He hadn't been back here in almost 7 years. Beside him, Grace didn't speak. She didn't ask questions. She simply waited. The trip hadn't been planned. He was supposed to fly to London that morning, an investors' summit, first class, every detail arranged. But when he woke up, suitcase packed, his mind full of numbers, all he could think about was Grace walking away from the gala, and the hollow sound of her heels on marble as she disappeared into the night. So, he canceled the flight and called her. "I need to go somewhere," he'd said. "I don't want to go alone." She hadn't asked why. She simply replied, "Okay, I'll come. Now." As they stood before the old house, James unlocked the door. The key turned slowly, as if the house itself had been holding its breath. The air inside smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. Dust danced in the sunlight coming through the front window. Everything was just as he had left it. The piano in the corner, the yellowed books stacked beside the fireplace. Her blanket folded neatly on the arm of the couch. He stepped in quietly, his footsteps muffled by the worn rug beneath his shoes. Grace followed, closing the door gently behind her. They didn't speak at first. Silence felt more appropriate, sacred. Almost. James walked to the mantel, tracing a finger along the edge. A photo still sat there, him and Elizabeth, arm in arm, her head thrown back in laughter. "She hated this picture," he said softly. Grace stepped closer, but said nothing. "She said her hair looked flat," he added, almost smiling. Then the smile faded. He took a slow breath, and when he spoke again, his voice had thinned. "She was sick for 13 months. At first, we thought it was treatable. Stage 2. Then it jumped to 4, like the cancer was racing against time." Grace watched his hands more than his face. She didn't want anyone to see her near the end. He said she was beautiful, always, but she hated how weak she looked. So she made me promise no visitors, no hospital photos. She wanted to leave as she had lived, with dignity. He swallowed hard, and after she was gone, I stayed here a while, long enough for the walls to echo everything I couldn't say out loud. Grace sat on the edge of the couch, her hands folded in her lap. James remained standing. I tried to move on. He continued, not just from her, but from feeling. The women I dated, they were a distraction. They didn't ask for depth, and I didn't offer it. He paused. His voice dropped lower. "But then, you." Grace looked up, but still said nothing. "You're different," he said. "You don't try to fix me. You don't smile to please or flatter to be chosen. You just see things, and somehow that's harder to face." The room fell quiet again, not heavy, just still. After a moment, Grace stood and walked to the window. "I used to want to teach college," she said. "I had a scholarship to pursue my master's in literature." James turned to her, surprised. "You never said. I never thought it mattered," she replied with a shrug. "What happened? My mother's diagnosis, the hospital bills. 1 semester turned into a year off, then 2. Eventually, I let it go. Do you regret it?" Grace turned back to him, her gaze calm. "No," she said simply. "Because even if life pulled me off the path, it didn't take away my ability to find meaning. I still read, still write, still see beauty in people even when they don't see it in themselves." She let the words settle, then added, "I still have time." James exhaled slow, deep, like something tight in his chest had finally loosened. They stood there, the afternoon sun warming the floor between them. No music, no grand gestures, just the quiet hum of understanding. James stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her eyes, but he didn't kiss her. And she didn't lean in. Instead, they stood quietly, breathing the same air, holding a space that had once been filled with memory, and now with possibility. They didn't kiss, but something deeper passed between them, something that asked for more time. They were just trying to feel again. But the world saw a scandal. It started with a photo, not posed, not staged, just a quiet moment caught by the wrong lens at the wrong time. James leaning in, Grace standing close, eyes lifted to his, a balcony, moonlight, and just enough proximity for the world to assume what it wanted. The headline arrived with morning coffee, Whitmore's secret romance billionaire, CEO sparks rumors with assistant at gala. And just like that, a private moment became public currency. By noon, it was everywhere. Tabloid blogs, finance channels. A talk show segment with a cheeky banner reading from boardroom to bedroom. It didn't matter that nothing had happened. Not the way they claimed, not yet, but truth was irrelevant, perception was louder. At Whitmore & Co., the fallout was immediate. The company's stock dipped 2.3% by mid-afternoon. Not catastrophic, but enough to spook shareholders. The board called an emergency meeting. James sat in the conference room, shoulders tight, jaw locked, as his directors tiptoed through carefully chosen words. "This isn't about morality," said one. "It's about optics. You've worked too hard for this company to become tabloid fodder," added another. An assistant slid a statement across the table. "Already drafted, already vetted by legal, Mr. Whitmore maintains a professional relationship with all employees. The recent rumors are inaccurate. There is no personal involvement." James stared at the paper. It might as well have been a mirror, clean, controlled, emotionless. He said nothing, just folded the paper and left the room. On the 33rd floor, Grace found a manila envelope on her desk. No note, no name. Inside a printout of the article, the photo circled in red. One sentence typed across the bottom, "Keep it professional," or "Resign," no signature, but she didn't need one. She closed the envelope slowly, as if sealing away a truth she had hoped wouldn't come for her. Then, with practiced hands, she opened the bottom drawer, took out a resignation form, and began to write. She didn't cry, didn't even pause. Her handwriting was steady, deliberate. She placed the form in a plain envelope, addressed it to James, and set it on his desk before lunch. Then she packed up quietly just her tote bag and a small framed photo of her mother from the corner of her screen. James returned to find the envelope. He knew before opening it. His name written in that neat, looping script she always used when labeling files. Inside, 2 lines stopped his breath. "This isn't because of the photo. It's because I won't let the world reduce me to a rumor." He found her in the lobby. She wore a soft gray coat. Nothing dramatic, no storm in her eyes. Just resignation and something like sadness, but older, calmer, like a wound she'd had before. "I'm sorry," he said. She turned. For what? For not stopping this? For letting them turn something simple into something ugly? "You didn't have a choice," she said gently. He stepped closer. "I had one." And then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, square velvet box. Grace froze. "Don't worry," he said, catching her look. "It's not a ring." He opened it. Inside was a key. Old brass, a little tarnished, the kind that belonged to something that mattered. She looked at him, confused. "To the house," he said. "The one we visited." Grace swallowed. "Why are you giving this to me? Because I haven't shared that space with anyone in years. But when you were there, it didn't hurt as much." Her fingers brushed the box, but she didn't take it. "This doesn't fix the headlines. I know. This doesn't change what people think. It's not for them," he said. "It's for you." He paused, then added, "I don't want to lose what we haven't even figured out yet." She looked down at the key again. "I'm not someone who fits into your world." "James, I'm not asking you to fit," he replied. "I'm asking you to stay." There was silence between them, long, slow. filled with all the things they couldn't say yet. Then, finally, she took the box, closed it, held it in her hand like something delicate, not yet defined. "You'll have to tell your board," she said softly, "that I didn't seduce the CEO, and I'll tell them," he said, "that the CEO has never been more sure about anything. It wasn't a ring. It was something far more unexpected, a key to something neither of them could name yet. Some people offered love with flowers. He offered her a foundation built on everything she believed in. James Whitmore had never been a man of gestures. He sent flowers when required. He signed checks with ease. He built towers, not foundations of the heart, but for the first time in years, he found himself needing to build something that didn't involve blueprints or square footage, something that would never appear in Forbes or on a quarterly report. It had taken him days to write the mission statement. Longer to name it, the Ellison Education Fund for Women. He said the name aloud several times, softly, as if testing whether it felt right. It did, not because it was grand, but because it carried her values and his quiet apology. On Saturday morning, Grace stood outside the white brick house once more. The key still felt warm in her palm, even though it had been sitting in her drawer all week. She wasn't sure why she came, but her heart had insisted. When James opened the door, he didn't smile, not out of coldness, but out of reverence, as if the moment didn't need words to be honored. He wore a soft gray sweater, sleeves pushed up, no watch, no tie. He led her into the living room, where the same couch waited the one she had sat on while he spoke of grief. This time, a leather folder sat on the table between them, not legal black, but a deep burgundy, the kind of color that looked like it held stories. Her name was embossed on the cover in gold. Grace raised an eyebrow. James nodded gently. "It's not what you think." She opened it. Inside, crisp parchment paper, carefully printed. The header read, "The Ellison Education Fund for Women. Empowering the return of women to higher education because it's never too late to begin again." Below that, a mission statement. And two signature lines. James Whitmore, founder, Grace Ellison, co-founder and educational director. She blinked. James took a breath. "I know this isn't how these things are usually done. And I know this might feel like too much." Grace didn't speak. Her fingers brushed the edge of the page. "I didn't create this to impress you," he said. "I did it because it's something I believe in, and because I wouldn't have believed in it without you." She closed the folder, resting her hand on top of it. "I don't know what to say. Don't say anything yet. Just know that this is yours as much as mine. And if you never want to see it again, I'll understand." She let silence fill the room, then finally asked, "Why me?" James looked at her, not with admiration but with quiet clarity. "Because you see people who are invisible to the rest of the world. Because you never asked for attention, but gave it freely to others. Because when I thought I was finished building, you reminded me that I'd never even started." A breath caught in her chest. "I'm not offering you a job," he added. "I'm offering you a legacy." Grace stood, pacing slowly. The windows let in warm light, but her mind was still walking through shadows of her past. "Before all of this," she said, "I had applied to go back to school. I didn't tell anyone, not even my mother." James stayed silent. "I've been accepted," she continued. "Night classes, part-time. I'm going back to finish what I left behind." He nodded. "That's good. I'd already written a new resignation letter. Before the photo, before the headlines." His lips parted slightly. "And you still left. I had to," she said. "Not because I didn't care, but because something inside me finally whispered, 'It's your turn now.'" The words hung in the air like truth. James stepped forward, not close enough to crowd her, but enough to meet her eyes fully. "Then let this fun grow with you," he said. "Let it be the road you walk while you finish your own. You don't have to choose between helping others and helping yourself." Grace looked at the folder again. The name on it, Ellison, not as a footnote in someone else's story, but as the beginning of her own. "I never imagined anyone would name something like this after me," she said quietly. "I didn't name it after you. He replied, "I named it for you." Her hand trembled just slightly as she reached for the pen. She signed, deliberate, slow, like she was stepping into her future with both feet. Then she closed the folder, exhaled, and smiled. Not out of romance, not out of flattery, but out of something stronger, recognition. James extended his hand not to shake, but to hold. She took it. Just for a moment, just enough. They smiled, not as lovers, not yet, but as two people walking the same road. Love doesn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes, it slips in between quiet coffees and shared glances. Their days settled into a quiet rhythm, not the rhythm of lovers swept up in passion, but of two people discovering something slower, something steadier, something real. The Ellison Education Fund had launched with a modest start, just 5 scholarship recipients in its first round. But each name meant a story, each application, a life paused and now beginning again. Grace and James visited every campus in person. They sat in community halls with peeling paint and in school libraries that smelled like old books and fresh coffee. They met women in their 30s and 40s, nursing students, future teachers, single mothers with eyes that held quiet fire. Grace lit up in those spaces. She remembered names. She brought notebooks filled with questions. She stayed late to talk with deans and wrote thank you notes by hand. And James watched her, not as a CEO assessing performance, but as a man witnessing a kind of grace he had never known. Sometimes he'd glance at her across a room and realize he was smiling, not because she was saying anything to him, but because she was simply being. In between the travel and meetings, they began to spend time in ways that had nothing to do with the foundation. He stopped sending his driver, started driving her home himself. Sometimes they'd stop at the farmer's market and argue about tomatoes. She preferred heirlooms. He claimed plum tomatoes were underrated. Other times, he'd show up at her apartment with takeout and an excuse to review scholarship metrics, only to fall asleep on her couch halfway through a documentary. It was never planned, never labeled, but it felt like life, unfolding. One Sunday afternoon, Grace invited James to come meet her mother. Linda Ellison lived in a small assisted living apartment not far from Grace's place. The space was tidy and full of soft light. With a window that overlooked a patch of garden, Linda insisted on tending herself. Grace brought flowers. James brought lemon scones. When he entered, Linda looked up from her crossword and gave him a long, appraising stare. "You're taller than I expected," she said. James smiled. "I get that a lot. And quieter," she added. "Good. The loud ones always disappoint." They laughed. Grace rolled her eyes. But something in James shifted as he watched mother and daughter move around each other. They didn't speak in code. They just belonged. It had been years since he'd felt that the simple comfort of being near love that didn't demand anything. When Grace touched her mother's arm or fetched her tea without being asked, James saw a kind of tenderness that made his own chest ache, not with envy, but with longing. That night, he stayed for dinner at Grace's apartment. She cooked pasta with roasted vegetables. He offered to help, which mostly involved chopping onions incorrectly and claiming her stove was temperamental. They ate with the windows open. The breeze carried the scent of jasmine in early summer. Afterward, James insisted on doing the dishes. Grace handed him a towel and leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching him. "You wash like someone who's never done this before," she teased. "I'm improving," he said. "This is my 3rd dish without a casualty." He smiled. She didn't. He glanced up, suddenly aware of her silence. "Grace," her voice came softly, measured, but raw. "I'm scared." He turned off the faucet. "I'm scared," she said again, more quietly now, "because I think I'm falling in love with you." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Grace's hands trembled slightly, but her eyes didn't waver. "I didn't mean to say it tonight," she whispered. "Maybe not ever. But I needed you to know. Because this, whatever this is, it matters to me. And that's terrifying." James didn't speak. He dried his hands slowly, stepped forward not to close the distance, but to honor it. Then he reached out and gently took her hand in his. Not to answer, not to promise, just to stay. He didn't reply with words. He just reached for her hand and didn't let go. She had survived without love for years, but now that it was here, it terrified her. For a long time, Grace had prided herself on her ability to stand alone. She had learned how to hold herself up when life felt like it was caving in through her mother's long illness. The loneliness of working nights, and the quiet ache of watching her dreams collect dust on a shelf she couldn't reach. She had done life without leaning. And then came James. Not all at once, but slowly. Like light seeping under a door she thought was locked. She hadn't expected to fall in love. And when she finally said the words, it felt like opening a window she'd boarded up years ago. But now that the air was rushing in, she didn't know how to breathe. At first, it was subtle. A glance she avoided, a touch she hesitated to return, an excuse to work late, or a suggestion that they keep things professional during meetings, even if the meetings were only the two of them. James noticed. Of course he did. But he didn't push. He gave her space just enough, and that made it worse somehow, because he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was being thoughtful, present, clear. She was the one retreating. Then came the messages. An old friend from her teaching days sent her a photo, a screenshot of a tabloid headline, Grace Ellison. From classroom to CEO's girlfriend, the caption below read, "Trading chalkboards for champagne." The sting was sharp, even if she knew it was petty. It wasn't the press that bothered her most. It was the whisper under it, the one that asked, "Who do you think you are?" Grace. To be living this life? She didn't answer the message, but the words stayed, lingered, eroded something fragile inside her. James, meanwhile, had begun stepping more confidently into whatever they were becoming. He spoke about her in meetings, mentioned her name in interviews when asked about the foundation. He didn't hide the way his eyes softened when she walked into a room. One night, after a quiet dinner at her apartment, Grace sat stiffly on the couch beside him. He reached for her hand, brushing his fingers gently across her knuckles. She flinched barely, but it was enough. He pulled back. There was a long silence, filled with unspoken questions. "Grace," he said finally, "what's happening?" She shook her head. "Nothing. I'm just tired. That's not what this is." She closed her eyes, tried to gather words that wouldn't come out jagged. I don't know how to be in this. Not when everyone's watching, not when it feels like people are waiting for me to mess it up. He sat back, let the silence settle again. "I don't care what they think," he said calmly. "I do," she replied. "I wish I didn't, but I do." Why, he asked? Because they think you don't belong with me, or because part of you believes them. The words hit harder than she expected. Not cruel, just true. Her chest tightened. "You don't understand." James leaned forward, his voice lower now. "I understand more than you think. I know what it's like to lose someone, to rebuild yourself from the ground up, to carry grief and guilt in equal measure." He paused. "But I also know what it feels like to choose joy again. And that's what I'm doing with you." Her throat tightened. "I'm not trying to take anything from you," he continued. "Not your independence, not your work, not your name." Grace looked away, blinking fast. "I've spent so long surviving," she whispered. "I don't know how to do more than that." James reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, silver key and placed it gently on the table between them. "To my apartment," he said softly. "I'm not asking you to move in. I'm not asking for anything." She stared at the key. "I'm giving you this because there's no door in my life I want to close to you. You don't have to walk through it, but I need you to know it's open." Grace didn't answer, couldn't. James stood. He didn't lean in for a kiss, didn't reach for her hand. He just looked at her, steady and sure. "Are you afraid of losing your freedom?" he asked, "or of being loved fully for the first time?" Then he turned, opened her door, and walked out into the night. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She sat in the hush of her apartment, the clock ticking louder than usual. Then, slowly, She reached forward and picked up the key. It was warm, heavier than she expected. She held it in her palm for a long moment as if weighing not just the metal, but everything it meant. She stared at the key, her heart loud in her chest. Love had knocked. Now it waited quietly by the porch light. The rain had been falling all morning, a soft, steady whisper against the windows of Grace's apartment. She sat on the edge of her bed, fully dressed but unmoving, the silver key James had left still resting in her palm. It had been 2 weeks, no calls, no messages, not because there was anger, but because he had left her a choice freely given, without expectation, and now it was time. She didn't wear anything fancy, just a navy blue coat, jeans, and the old boots her mother used to tease her about. She carried nothing but a leather folder, the one James had given her when they started the Ellison Fund, and she drove through the drizzle, the gray streets, the familiar curve of the road leading to the white brick house that had become more than a memory. It was no longer a home for one man's grief. It was a center now, a space for learning, for healing, for starting again. Women stood outside, chatting under umbrellas, young, older, mothers, students. Some held notebooks, others carried babies, and inside, through the wide windows, she saw him. James stood at the front of the repurposed living room, which now held folding chairs and a whiteboard. He wore a light gray sweater, his sleeves rolled up, his voice soft but certain. He was teaching, not business, not strategy, but confidence, the kind that doesn't come from wealth, but from being seen. And if someone tells you, James was saying, that it's too late for you, smile, because that means they've never met someone like you. Laughter, soft applause, and then he looked up and saw her. Grace didn't smile, not yet. She simply stood at the back of the room, her coat damp from the rain, her heart wide open for the first time in years. Their eyes locked. No performance, no expectation, just knowing, after class. He didn't rush to her. He finished answering a question from a woman about resume formatting. He shook hands with a young mother holding a toddler. Only then did he walk to her. No words, just a breath between them. Then he gently opened the front door and nodded toward the porch. The rain had stopped. The air was cool, clean. The porch light glowed with a soft, amber warmth. They stood beneath it, close but not touching. Grace took a deep breath. "I was scared," she said, "not of you, of what it would mean to be fully known." James listened, silent. "I spent so many years managing life, making it work, holding it together. I didn't realize how lonely surviving could feel until you gave me something more." He reached out slowly, brushing a strand of damp hair from her cheek. "And now," he asked gently. Grace swallowed. "Now I want to live, not manage, not survive, live, with messy feelings, with risk, with you?" James didn't smile with triumph. He didn't pull her into a dramatic kiss. He just leaned in, forehead to forehead. "I don't need you to be anyone else," he whispered. "Not my assistant, not the perfect partner, just Grace." She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were wet, but not from rain. Then finally they kissed, not rushed, not interrupted, but deep, certain, rooted in all the unsaid things they had walked through. It wasn't a beginning, it was a becoming. They sat on the porch steps afterward, shoulders touching. The sky had begun to open, revealing patches of soft gold light. Grace handed him the leather folder. "I updated the scholarship proposal," she said, "added a mentorship track and a wellness stipend." He looked at her, eyes soft. "I missed this," he said. "Me too." She replied, "Not just you, me. I missed myself. Before fear made me small." In the weeks that followed, things didn't change overnight. But quietly, consistently, life grew. Grace began teaching part-time at a community college nearby. James stepped back from day-to-day operations of his real estate firm, choosing instead to mentor and build quietly. Linda Grace's mother attended one of their events, smiling as James fetched her tea like an old friend. The Ellison Fund expanded, new voices joined, new women found their way back to education and to themselves. And in the quiet moments over coffee, on the porch, during long walks with no destination, Grace and James learned how to love, not perfectly, but truthfully, and for the first time in years, she said yes to love, to herself, to the life she never thought she deserved. In a world that often rewards perfection, polish, and control, this story gently reminds us of something deeper, that real connection begins the moment we let our guard down. James had wealth, power, and charm, but none of it could fill the silence left by grief. Grace had sacrifice, resilience, and compassion, but she'd long buried her own dreams. Both had learned how to survive, but neither had learned how to fully live until they saw one another, not as roles or expectations, but as human beings shaped by loss and still capable of love. The true lesson here is simple yet profound. It's never too late to begin again, not just in love, but in allowing yourself to be known, to be vulnerable, to be loved for exactly who you are. And perhaps, the bravest thing we can do in this life is say yes. Yes to hope, yes to healing, yes to someone who sees you and stays. Thank you for spending time with us today. If this story touched your heart, even just a little, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to Shining Stories. Your support helps us keep telling stories that heal, connect, and remind us of what truly matters. We'd love to hear from you in the comments because every story deserves to be heard, especially yours.